After replacing the car's engine, we pulled apart a lot of the wiring that makes this 78 Firebird run. Before we lay out everything in the engine bay though, I needed to decide which wires would make their way through the firewall to feed a yet-to-be-determined array of gauges, lights, and switches. We previously replaced the central air vents with an additional pair of gauges, but I've gone mad with power and want even more. In fact, I've got a pretty extensive functional makeover in mind, so let's get right into it by disassembling what we've currently got. With the steering wheel removed and column hanging loose, we have plenty of room to easily remove the dash panel and disconnect the existing aftermarket readouts. We'll remove 4 screws to slide out the gauge cluster, disconnect the speedo cable, and unplug the cluster wires that I sketchily extended. 2 screws hold on the rear defrost switch cover, and beneath it 2 more attach the switch itself. We won't be needing the rear defrost function, so once the connector has been separated, it will be taped off and tucked away under the dash. My initial thought was to mount a pair of toggle switches vertically in the existing openings of this bracket, and I even went through the process of making a panel to do just that before deciding I wanted indicator lights next to the switches as well. To make room for all that, we'll remove the lighter socket assembly, unclip the attached light bulb, and disconnect the ground and power wires. Then it'll travel over to the vise where the angle grinder is waiting to make some adjustments. Even after cutting out the center divider though, the 2 switches are actually a tiny bit too wide. To fit those and keep some semblance of structure, we'll make a pair of notches and bend the inside edge over instead of just cutting it out. That gets us exactly enough room, so it's time for switch panel Mark II. We'll be cutting it out of 16 gauge aluminum to keep it thin enough to fit behind the main dash panel, and once we have the general shape, 2 holes can be drilled to line up with the old panel's mounting holes, and adding a third all the way through should enable us to add some rigidity. That assembly can be mounted to make sure everything still fits, and to mark the gauge panel opening. Taking that back off, we'll mark the bracket opening as well and use those outlines to figure out the best place to fit our components. After pilot drilling 4 holes, we'll size up 2 to fit toggle switches and 2 to fit indicator lights, which snap in nicely. Another test assembly goes swimmingly, so it's time to give that a little Scotch-Brite cleanup and get ready to put the panel together for good. While I do like these little Dorman lights, there's one thing I really don't care for. They kind of just fall apart. A few small pieces of adhesive heat shrink seem to do the trick, so let's go ahead and tighten a pair of switches to the panel face, pop in the lights, add a little hot glue to make sure they stay put, and hook a 12-volt power supply to a few jump leads to explain the general concept. The left switch is a momentary, while the right one is a toggle. Yeah, it's pretty fun. I should have added a third one that just did nothing for when you're sitting in traffic. And a few labels later, all that's left is attaching wires properly. We're going to use a bunch of these connectors. They're sealed, simple, commonly available, and cheap. For smaller loads, these are totally adequate, pretty easy to put together, so you'll see me use these guys for all kinds of things. And while you certainly can crimp them by hand with a universal tool like these, a ratcheting crimper with the H7 size die is just about perfect. I find it's a little bit loose, but it does a pretty good job with these. So let's get to work on the switch panel and simplify the 4 components down to a single connector. That's going to be considered finished until the body side of the car is wired for it, though we can rust convert, reassemble, and reinstall the lighter outlet to the dashboard so that we are fully ready to move on to the next project, modifying the main dash panel. For the full, complicated array of the features I want this car to have, we're going to need more indicator lights, which I decided would fit nicely right beside the main gauge cluster. We're going to add a trio of 12mm holes to hold a trio of lights. We'll definitely have to glue them in place so they're not just... We'll test them all to make sure they work, because I've had a few of these Dorman lights actually fail as a result of the wires coming loose. So to help them out, we'll add on some adhesive heat shrink. It would have been nice for them to ship that way, but at least they're held together now, which is more than I can say for the plastic gauge surrounds on the dash panel. Someone before me had used some type of clear silicone to hold them in, which didn't work very well, and I had to painstakingly remove it all in order to get my adhesive of choice to stick. This will hold the bezels better and be very easy to remove and reapply if needed. And after that, my installation method for the indicator lights shouldn't come as a shock. The panel is starting to look pretty snazzy, but it is still missing something. The turn signal indicators are supposed to have these little green lenses behind them. The only problem is I only have one of these. These are what I had been using. 2 layers of window tint over top of a clear red plastic plate. Of course, the color red is not ideal, so I went looking and came across these on eBay, sold as a close fit for this application. They're still pretty clear compared to the old one, so we'll break out the 20% window tint, which darkens the lenses, rub those with some 400 grit sandpaper to increase light diffusion, and I think we have an acceptable result. We'll press those into rings of hot glue with the tint side facing outward, and you can kind of make out the scratches still, but it's not bad. It'll certainly do the trick for this car. Good enough is also where we're going to settle with our auxiliary gauge selection, starting with these relatively budget-friendly electrical models. These use variable resistance senders. We already put one in the transmission pan, and now we'll install another into the passenger side cylinder head to read engine coolant temperature. The driver's side head will have a switch installed, once again matching one in the transmission, to turn on an indicator light if the engine climbs north of 235 degrees. These gauges all come with incandescent bulbs, but it would be nice to use cooler running LEDs. I went through several models, even modifying some of them to try to tailor the amount and quality of light produced, before landing on these, which were both sold as amber in color. They definitely appear more artificially yellow than a conventional bulb, but stand out less than a cold white LED. The final touch comes in the form of colored silicone caps to farther alter the tint and give the bulbs an orange glow, which is a decent match for the factory gauge lighting in my 1991 Firebird that I adore so much. I'm such a fan, in fact, that the non-replaceable and non-tinted bulb in the Bosch oil pressure gauge was going to make me crazy, so I decided to go through the somewhat destructive process of disassembling it in order to figure out a way to make it better match everything else. There's an incandescent bulb buried real deep behind the gauge face, and those wires are just soldered. This has one of the really bright LEDs just shoved in the back of the gauge housing, and compared to the bulbs the rest of these gauges are going to be using, it's kind of dim. I'm not entirely sure how I was driven to this stage of orange madness, but this is when I found myself cutting apart and drilling holes in the gauge circuit board to allow the passage of light, and filing out the rear of the housing to make it compatible with a generic bulb holder. We'll then reassemble the gauge, painting the dark gray bezel black to better match the others, and after popping that back on, we can bask in its orange glow. Can't help but notice that the gauge doesn't quite zero out anymore. I'm sure it's not my fault, right? How could it be? And let's not even get into the fact that I found out that these exist after going through all that. We'll be running an engine oil pressure switch alongside the gauge sender, which will share a T-fitting that we'll be installing at the 1/4-inch NPT port at the rear of the engine block. We'll apply thread sealer to each connection and tighten all of that down using a special GM type socket for the switch. Then, with the addition of some sketchy wiring, we'll take the gauge and indicator light for a test run. The light is wired to illuminate with oil pressure, the opposite of how it'll be set up on the dashboard, but everything does seem to be working as we spin the oil pump, and the readings match those of the mechanical gauge we previously had hooked to the engine. I just noticed this pool of oil valve cover is leaking right there. And in the same spot on the other side, it's leaking too. Hopefully we can sort out the valve cover leak by just replacing the gaskets. With the valve cover off, this all looks normal, but the Velcro does look a little bit taller. Width, we're looking at 0.18, 0.16 inches, so it is a little bit narrower. Height-wise, 0.27 inches, 0.29. So the out-of-the-box Velcro gasket is definitely larger, and hopefully will do a better job of filling in the gap between valve cover and cylinder head. We'll get the cover back in position and tighten to 72 inch-pounds, then head to the driver's side to repeat the process of removing the cover, swapping the gasket, and tightening it back down. I haven't noticed any oil leaking since making this change, so hopefully that did the trick for good. Okay, getting back on track, let's fit our 3 gauges to the dash panel that will be their new home. We had to do a little filing to fit one front and center where the factory combination gauge was previously housed, which we'll talk more about later, but we were able to get everything mounted and eventually wired up. The gauge side of this is all done, and the wires for the warning lights are tucked up in there. We are also able to do a successful functions test, and everything works. So that's this panel done. Let's move on to the next one. There are 3 more gauges I want to fit somewhere on the dashboard, and the empty slot that once held the radio seems like as good a spot as any. The plastic surround has already been quite roughly trimmed to fit the cheap generic head unit that was in the car when I bought it, so I don't feel bad taking out the top and bottom sections to make room for the new setup. We've got the trans temp gauge, the AFR gauge, and the trans pressure gauge. We will be able to fit all 3 there, but the AFR gauge is kind of annoying because when it's mounted it sits quite proud of the surface. But this gauge is a very nice fit in 2-inch PVC. So we'll cut a small section of that out and turn down the outer diameter until it more closely matches the gauge bezels, which is a very stringy process but does work quite well. After those spacer rings have been cut to length, we have a much more visually pleasing set of mismatched gauges. All we need is a panel to mount them in, which we'll be making out of 1/8 inch aluminum. After pilot drilling, we'll use a 2-inch hole saw to rough out the gauge mounting positions, before using a round file to clean things up and ensure a nice snug fit. Now we can cut the panel out, being careful as the top and bottom edges are quite thin, and after a bit of shaping and drilling for the mounting hardware, it's a nice fit and you can see where the screws are going to go. I'm worried that this plastic is not going to be thick enough or is going to be too brittle, so I'm going to mix up some JB Weld and thicken up the back of this plastic, then we'll pre-drill it after that cures. The screws were all able to tighten down just fine, and the panel mounts solidly enough to move the whole dash, so I'm pretty sure that will be plenty to hold our gauges in place. After a quick cleanup pass, we're ready to install the air-fuel ratio gauge, the boost gauge with a painted spacer and shortened mounting bracket, and last but not least, the transmission pressure gauge and its spacer. With the panel looking pretty tidy and the gauges at least matching one another in height, it's time to get those fully wired up and bench tested as much as is possible. Everything seems to be working and the final test fit goes perfectly, so we can once again move on and get to the last piece of the dashboard puzzle, the original gauge cluster. There are 2 things I'd like to accomplish here. The first is replacing the factory oil and temp gauge, and the second is getting the tach to read correctly. It hasn't been hooked up in a few years because it shows a significantly lower RPM than the engine is actually turning at, making it close to useless. Supposedly you can change resistors or do certain things to recalibrate it, but instead of that, we're going to be using this complete replacement circuit board. That little potentiometer screw there, you can see there's a line on it marking the calibration. Turning that will adjust the reading. For both of these modifications, we're going to have to start disassembling the cluster, and my circuit board was delaminating, so some of this is a little bit janky. We'll start by removing all of the bulb holders from the back, and then we'll take out all the fasteners holding the flexible circuit board to the housing so that it can be lifted off. After that, there are only 2 screws left holding in the combination gauge, so we can work that out as well. The last thing we want to take out of the cluster is the tachometer, which is going to require removing the clear lens, but we've encountered a problem. The screw for the clock setting knob is broken off. Obviously that didn't go so well for somebody. With the dual application of pliers and some weaponized wiggling, we were able to loosen things up just the tiniest bit. I can probably walk that screw out of there over the course of the next 20 to 30 years. Once fully unscrewed, we can remove the broken part and the knob itself, which finally frees the lens. After that, the surround can lift right off, and once 6 more screws are out of the way, we can disconnect the pair of leads to the tack mounting plate and remove the gauge itself. At which point I realized that this looks different. Oh, crap. This is the board for a 78 and later tack. This change only happened about halfway through 1978. Based on the markings, I'm guessing this probably was from a different car. Either way, that board was not going to work, and this one looks like it will. While this was a part, I also really wanted to get the clock working because I think it's cool. It's never worked since I've had the car. There's points inside of there, and those wear down over time. There's a company out there that makes conversion kits for these to upgrade them to a quartz movement, a more modern style, and I tried to get one, but 2 problems. First, I don't even think this is the right kit. And anyway, it turned out that this new old stock one I bought off of eBay has already been used. No clock for us. But hopefully we can get something to work. This replacement tack board is adjustable in the same way, and with any luck, will fit our tachometer and work out of the box. The control board is just held in place with 3 bullet connectors for the power, ground, and ignition coil sources, and has a pair of output wires that connect to the gauge windings. We'll give those tiny connectors a little tweak to ensure a snug fit, get them in place on the new circuit board, and after triple checking to make sure it's the right way around, that can be popped onto the rest of the gauge. In hindsight, I should have tested the new board at this point, but I was caught up in doing too many things at once, and before we put the cluster back together, I had my eyes set on some serious butchery. We're going to be replacing the combination gauge with a regular aftermarket one. Both needles move, but the water temp is vague at best and does tend to jump around instead of reading smoothly. The oil pressure gauge would only read very occasionally, and even when it was doing something, it didn't seem real happy about it. I assume that both of these gauges could be restored and recalibrated, but I don't have the money nor the time to make that happen. What I do have, however, is a 2.5-inch hole saw. We need to embiggen the opening at the front of the cluster so that a standard 2 1/16" gauge mounted to the dash panel can fit. Yeah, that definitely felt bad, but you can't just be precious with everything forever. We've got the clear piece screwed on just like hand tight. We'll use the hole we already drilled as a guide so that we can have a complete pass-through. If there's any solace in this, it's just that the parts were not great to begin with. After a successful dash panel test fit, it's time to reassemble the gauge cluster, starting with the tack. Once the wires have been reconnected, the rear panel can go back on, then the modified front surround and lens, followed by the clock knob and a new old stock part. I was very surprised to so easily find a replacement fastener to replace the broken one, but here we are and on it goes. Now it's time to reinstall the circuit for the whole thing, only we're not going to. I'm going to do something a little bit different here. This little pigtail socket did not go to the market. What these are really made for is mounting on something like this. Here we've got the 5 connectors for the gauge backlighting installed. For the indicator lights, we're not using the orange caps, just a regular bulb. And with that, all of our bulbs are in place. Especially for the tack over here, since there's not really a light coming from this side at all, we will make a plate to the bolts here, starting off, as usual, with a cardboard template. Once transferred to 16 gauge aluminum, that design needs holes drilled for the mounting screws, a pair of bulb sockets, and we'll use a 7/8 inch spade bit to carve out the ends of a slot that will allow passage for the oil pressure gauges, wires, and connector. We'll cut the plate out and then do some more filing to add the notches used by our bulb sockets. That got a little messed up, but that's okay. We can go ahead and install this. And once the lights are in place, start grouping and wiring them all up. But while testing along the way, I ran into a snag. I just started connecting these to the test power supply when there was a big spark. There's a little tab that hangs over the edge a bit, so if it's in a metal housing and you wiggle the socket just right, it'll contact it. I tried a few different things, and we're just going to go with the most effective solution, which is electrical tape. I'm just going to put a little bit at the edge of each of these sockets. I did a test, it totally works. Even if you take it out, put it back in a couple of times. So we're going to apply a bunch of little pieces to hopefully prevent a blown fuse. And with that mitigated, we can do a full illumination test. Totaling just half an amp, the cluster is lit up quite nicely, and while the oil pressure gauge is still on the bright side, I think it's looking good overall. Started to notice yet another flaw with these sockets. If you wiggle wire into just the right spot, it loses touch. So I think our little friend hot glue is also going to make an appearance here. Filling in the backs of the sockets will keep the terminals from moving around and additionally hold them far enough inward to prevent a short circuit with the housing, but we'll be keeping the tape on there just in case. We'll finish the illumination wiring and give all of that a wiggle test before hooking up all of the indicator lights, trying to keep the bundle of wires as tidy as possible. By the end of setting all of this up, I can definitely see the value in paying more for complete aftermarket clusters and dashboard sets, but as always, I think piecing it together yourself has value too. You can't put a price tag on the experience of overcoming these types of obstacles, and you may even learn something in the process. I, for one, figured out that there is such a thing as too many gauges. So if I ever see this, I should probably just duck and roll out of the vehicle as fast as possible. This is interesting. I just noticed both fit nicely. And there's smoke coming out of the drill, so we're going to stop there. With that fitment on the pipe. Oh, no way. Always check your pipes, I guess. He really doesn't want to come out of there. Just going to encourage him. Oh. Use a regular wood. Anytime I say power supply, what I mean is this random charger. Stuck alligator clamps on the end of this years and years ago, and it makes pretty good sparks.